twilight seeps through the crooked teeth of the ancient trees, casting shadows that shift and writhe like living things across the tangled undergrowth. The mist, a shroud so dense it seems woven from the breath of the dead, clings to the ground, pooling around ankles and swallowing all but the closest shapes. Somewhere far off, a branch snaps, its sharp report muffled by the thick air, but still distinct enough to raise the hairs on the back of every neck gathered around the fire. The villagers have retreated to this clearing, just outside the forest's devouring edge, their faces flickering with the uncertain light of the flames. Their eyes dart between the darkness and each other, each one searching for assurance that none truly possesses. No one speaks of the exact hour when the mist crawled down from the hills and began to suffocate the valley, but all remember the way it settled, unyielding and cold, as if it were a warning sealed with every breath. Even the most hardened woodsmen, whose lives have always been stitched to the rhythm of these trees, now avoid the old paths and glance nervously over their shoulders. The forest is older than memory, its roots tangled with the bones of things that never had names, and its heart remains untouched by human hands. Yet, in the last few weeks, something has shifted. Children whisper of figures glimpsed between the trunks. Women wake gasping from dreams of hands dragging them down beneath the moss, and the men, too proud to admit their fear, have begun to carve strange symbols into their doors each night. Tonight, the assembled faces tell stories in low, urgent tones, voices trembling as they recount the old legends. Witches with eyes of pitch who ride the wind, demons that gnaw on the souls of the unwary, and the wind itself, said to carry voices that beg, mock, and threaten all who listen. Some scoff, trying to break the spell of fear, but their laughter rings hollow and quickly sputters out. The fire does little to drive back the cold. Instead, it seems to draw the mist closer, as if the forest itself is curious, hungry for what huddles at its edge. Among the villagers, a handful of outsiders listen with rapt attention. They are not here for comfort or kinship, but for answers. Experts in folklore, psychology, and history, each with their own reasons for trespassing where caution would counsel retreat. Their notebooks remain closed for now, their questions unasked. Their presence is a silent challenge to the tales, a skepticism that tightens the tension in the air. Yet, even they cannot ignore the way the wind sometimes carries a sound that is not quite a voice, or the faint taste of iron that lingers on the tongue when the mist grows thickest. The line between what is real and what is imagined has begun to blur, and not all are certain which side they stand on. The old symbols carved into bark and bone have begun to appear deeper within the forest, their meanings lost, but their intent unmistakable. Warnings, or perhaps invitations. Someone, something has been watching, moving just out of sight, its presence felt more than seen. Every snap of a twig, every shiver of the leaves overhead becomes a message, a reminder that the forest's silence is not emptiness, but anticipation. As the final colors of dusk bleed into night, those gathered near the fire realize that the stories they tell are not just inherited fears, but living things, shadows that stretch and twist as easily as the branches above them. The air is thick with secrets, each breath a negotiation between terror and disbelief, and every heartbeat another drumbeat in a ritual as old as the woods themselves. No one can say for certain where the legend ends and reality begins, or what price might be paid for daring to find out. But as the flames gutter and the mist closes in, There is no denying that something waits in the darkness, patient and hungry, listening for the next soul brave or foolish enough to step across the threshold. Beyond the wavering firelight, the forest seems to rearrange itself with every blink, as though the landscape is a living puzzle intent on confounding those who dare to observe it too closely. Where one might expect the usual order of underbrush and tree trunks, instead there are sudden clearings where nothing grows, or clusters of stones stacked in deliberate but indecipherable patterns. These features are not merely oddities. They serve as silent challenges to the assumptions of those who believe the world is mapped and understood. Now, imagine the disquiet that seeps in when familiar logic falters, when a compass needle spins without cause, or a shadow stretches against the wind. In these woods, the ordinary rules unravel, replaced by an architecture of uncertainty. Moving deeper, the villagers' most guarded superstitions begin to surface, whispered only when the mist thickens and the night presses in. They speak of the wandering veil, a phenomenon said to move through the forest, erasing trails and memories alike. Those who have encountered it describe a sudden, suffocating silence, as if sound itself has been stilled by unseen hands. In the aftermath, the afflicted often return with no memory of their journey, carrying only a sense of time stolen and a haunting dread that clings for days. This collective experience breeds a particular kind of fear, not the fear of monsters, but the terror of becoming lost in oneself, of returning home with something vital missing. Meanwhile, the visiting experts, unburdened by the villagers' inherited anxieties, turn their scrutiny to the symbols gouged into tree bark and stone. They note peculiar consistencies, spirals that never close, runes reminiscent of archaic alphabets, and patterns that echo the geometry of ritualistic sites found oceans away. They speculate about the origins, ancient cults, perhaps, or the vestiges of a language meant for something other than human understanding. One anthropologist, a woman with a sharp eye for detail and a voice barely louder than the wind, sketches the markings obsessively, her hands trembling as she tries to decipher meaning from chaos. Her notes veer into the speculative, proposing that these symbols serve not as mere warnings, but as invitations, gateways meant to lure the curious or the desperate into communion with whatever intelligence dwells here. Shifting focus, consider the subtle manipulations of the forest itself. Unexplained phenomena mount, the sudden chill that creeps up the spine, the uncanny sensation of being followed by eyes embedded in the moss, the unplaceable sense, iron, wet earth, a faint sweetness that turns acrid without warning. Now, reflect on how these sensory assaults wear down resolve, compelling even the most rational to question the reliability of their own perceptions. It is not the grand spectacle of terror that unravels the mind, but the relentless erosion of certainty. Each moment spent beneath the ancient canopy is a negotiation with one's own instincts. To ignore them is to risk calamity, yet to heed them is to surrender to a paranoia that blurs the boundary between caution and delusion. Adding to this tapestry of unease, the villagers' daily rituals become increasingly elaborate, bordering on the obsessive. Before dusk, they weave intricate knots from red thread and hang them in thresholds, muttering half-remembered prayers to ward off what lurks in the gloom. Children are forbidden to speak after sunset, their mouths smudged with salt and ash, measures meant to confuse listening spirits. These customs, dismissed by outsiders as relics of a fearful past, acquire new gravity as the nights lengthen and the unexplained grows more frequent. The line between protective right and desperate compulsion begins to blur, hinting at a deeper, shared anxiety. That belief may be the only barrier left against encroaching madness. Finally, as night deepens and the fire dwindles, a new motif asserts itself: silence, heavy and watchful, settling over the clearing like a second mist. Conversations falter, eyes dart toward the trees, and every attempt at comfort rings hollow. In this hush, the villagers and their guests alike sense a presence pressing in from all sides, intangible yet undeniable. It is as if the forest itself has become aware of their gathering, attentive to each heartbeat, each flutter of doubt. The effect is cumulative, a slow tightening of the chest, a realization that the greatest threat may not be what prowls the darkness, but what the darkness awakens within. The air thickens as the hours drag on, and nerves fray beneath the surface. The gathering is no longer merely huddled for warmth, but for the illusion of safety. At the periphery, the mist seems to pulsate, drawing attention to the boundaries between what is protected and what remains vulnerable. One of the villagers, a stooped man with hands chapped from years of labor, suddenly bolts upright. His expression is not merely fear but recognition, as if something in the shifting darkness speaks directly to a memory he has tried to repress. Without warning, he points toward a gnarled yew at the edge of the clearing, his voice barely more than a rasp. He insists that the tree has always been there, but tonight its trunk bears a new wound, a deep, jagged gash that oozes a sap as dark as blood. Rather than dismissing this as the product of heightened anxiety, the experts exchange wary glances. One, a linguist who prides herself on skepticism, retrieves a flashlight and approaches the tree. The beam reveals not just the wound, but a cluster of tiny, hand-shaped prints pressed into the bark, each one smaller than a child's palm, yet oddly elongated. The villagers recoil, some crossing themselves, others muttering unfamiliar names into their sleeves. The linguist, though rattled, sketches the marks with shaking hands, her meticulous notes now disrupted by the tremor in her script. She whispers about apotropaic symbols, but no one is listening. All eyes are trained on the forest, now alive with the possibility that something has breached their last defenses. Simultaneously, a young boy slips away from the group, drawn not by curiosity, but by a compulsion that defies explanation. He moves as if in a trance, his feet barely disturbing the carpet of wet leaves. When his mother notices his absence, panic erupts, shouts piercing the silence, and the delicate truce with the night shatters. The villagers fan out, calling his name, their voices swallowed by the fog. Amid the chaos, an outsider, a psychologist with a tendency to rationalize, suggests the boy is simply hiding, playing a game. Yet there is no childish laughter. Instead, the only response is a series of low, rhythmic knocks, echoing from deep within the woods, as if someone or something is signaling in code. The search pushes deeper, and the forest closes in with every step. No one can agree on which direction the knocks originate. The echoes ricochet in ways that defy the normal laws of sound, leaving rescuers disoriented and fractious. Someone stumbles upon a patch of earth where the leaves are arranged in a perfect spiral, their stems pointing inward. It is a pattern too deliberate to be natural, and its center is marked by a single withered feather. The discovery halts everyone in their tracks. Even the most vocal skeptics falter, their certainty crumbling under the weight of evidence that resists rational interpretation. Now, reflect on how swiftly the communal sense of order unravels when a child is lost. Survival instincts eclipse reason, and old grievances surface as blame is cast. First at outsiders for meddling, then at one another for not being vigilant enough. The air is charged with accusation and desperation, every word sharp and brittle. The psychologist's insistence on logic grows brittle. The villagers' faith in ritual teeters on collapse. In this moment, the forest is not just a backdrop, but an active participant. Its silence now oppressive, its darkness more intimate. Each person, driven by fear and a gnawing sense of helplessness, is forced to reconsider the limits of what they believe possible. What would you do if you felt the world you trusted was quietly conspiring to take something precious from you, and all you could do was wander, calling into a void that refuses to answer? Not far from the frantic search, a subtle transformation unfolds. Invisible to those too consumed by panic to notice, the forest's atmosphere thickens with a tension that seems almost sentient, as if the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for an outcome it already knows. In this altered state, time feels unwoored. Watches tick erratically, and the moon slips behind the clouds, leaving only guesswork to mark the passing of minutes. Now, imagine the peculiar disorientation that sets in when the familiar rhythm of the world falters. Each step becomes unsteady, not just from fear, but from the eerie sensation that the ground beneath your feet might dissolve or tilt if you dare to focus too closely. Further inside the thicket, one of the outsiders, a botanist drawn by curiosity and a secret longing for the uncanny, discovers a patch of flora entirely out of sync with the expected order. Flowers, pale as bone and shaped like tiny bells, bloom in spirals along the roots of an ancient beech. Their petals tremble at the slightest movement, as if listening for secrets carried in the air. The botanist, compelled by a mixture of awe and dread, bends closer, observing that each blossom contains a drop of viscous amber liquid. Without conscious intent, she reaches out, but the moment her fingers brush a petal, a piercing cold surges through her hand, and a soundless vibration hums in her bones. She jerks away, shaken by the realization that she has disturbed something that was not meant to be touched. This encounter prompts a new unease, one rooted not in the threat of visible monsters, but in the uncanny sensation of being witnessed by the world itself, judged by an intelligence older and more patient than her own. Beyond the reach of the searchers' lanterns, the mist reveals another anomaly, a cluster of stones, arranged in a deliberate arch, their surfaces scored with grooves that pulse faintly with phosphorescent light. A villager, separated from the others by accident or fate, stumbles upon this structure. He hesitates, torn between the ingrained warnings of his elders and a compulsion to cross beneath the stones. As he stands at the threshold, a wave of vertigo washes over him. Images rush through his mind, hands clawing out of the soil, faces half remembered from childhood nightmares, and a voice, low and insistent, urging him forward. He retreats in terror, aware that he has come uncomfortably close to a threshold that exists both in the world and within himself. This fleeting brush with the unknown leaves him changed, subtly but irrevocably, his perception of reality forever fractured by the possibility that some doors, once glimpsed, can never be unseen. Meanwhile, back at the edge of the clearing, the remaining villagers and experts become acutely aware of how isolation exposes raw nerves. With the group divided, Alliances shift and suspicions breed in the vacuum of certainty. Tensions flare over the proper course of action. Some argue for retreat, others insist on pressing deeper. The dynamic becomes a crucible, magnifying each individual's unspoken fears and grudges. What was once a collection of neighbors and strangers transforms into a volatile assembly, each member haunted by private anxieties that the mist seems to draw out and amplify. This atmosphere of suspicion and self-doubt is no less dangerous than any lurking creature. It is, in fact, the perfect soil for the seeds of despair and madness to take root. Consider now the subtle, insidious nature of this unraveling, where the threat is not always a matter of claws or curses, but the gradual erosion of the boundaries that keep one whole. The uncanny thrives in the spaces between certainty and doubt, feeding on hesitation and the refusal to trust one's own senses. In such a climate, every fleeting image, every inexplicable chill becomes important. The forest's true horror lies not in what it reveals, but in what it suggests, a world where the very act of perceiving might be a trap, and the mind's efforts to protect itself only hasten its undoing. Reflecting on this journey so far, it is as though we have wandered through a labyrinth constructed not of stone, but of shifting impressions and unseen currents, each turn deepening our sense of uncertainty. In this place, the familiar signposts of safety, reason, tradition, companionship have been quietly eroded by something more primal, leaving only the flicker of intuition to light the way. The further we venture, the more apparent it becomes that the forest does not simply surround, but infiltrates, seeping into the marrow of those who dare to enter, transforming every certainty into a question whispered on the wind. Within this twilight realm, the boundaries between observer and observed dissolve, and the act of seeking answers becomes tangled with the fear of what might be found. Each encounter, whether subtle or jarring, resonates with the suggestion that revelation is less an illumination than a distortion, a warping of perspective that reverberates long after the immediate threat has passed. When dawn at last edges its pale fingers through the tangled canopy, the world outside the forest appears unchanged. Fields ripen, rivers run, and the everyday routines of the village resume with practiced determination. Yet, for those who ventured into the mist, something fundamental has shifted, a quiet fracture running beneath the surface of waking life. The memory of cold, whispering winds and the sensation of unseen eyes do not fade with the return of sunlight. Instead, they settle deeper, becoming part of the fabric of thought, coloring every shadow and silence with new significance. The world, once so sharply divided between the safe and the unknown, now appears as a single, trembling membrane, stretched thin over the unseen depths beneath. The stories told by the fireside, those that once seemed like idle superstition, linger in the mind, not as relics of ignorance, but as signposts marking the limits of certainty. To move through the world after such an experience is to understand that the border between the explicable and the mysterious is not fixed, but shifts with the changing light, with the subtle tremors of fear and hope that pass through each of us. The ancient forest, with its mist and its secrets, becomes more than a place on a map. It becomes a metaphor for the places within ourselves we dare not tread, the questions we fear to ask, and the truths that flicker at the edge of comprehension. Those who return from the woods find themselves haunted less by what they saw than by what they sensed. A presence that defies explanation, a feeling that the land itself is alive with memory and intent. This haunting is not simply a burden, it is also an invitation. To live with the awareness that not all can or should be known is to move through life with humility, with the courage to listen for what is not spoken, and to see the world as a place always on the cusp of revelation. The horror, then, is not merely in the thought of being watched from the darkness, but in the realization that we, too, are participants in an ancient dialogue, our fears and desires echoing back at us from places we cannot see. In the hush that follows the ordeal, a strange kind of wisdom emerges, fragile but persistent. It is the knowledge that every legend, every whispered warning, contains a kernel of truth, not in its literal details, but in its recognition of the limits of human control and understanding. The forest's mist may dissipate, the fire's last ember may fade, but the questions remain. What do we carry with us from the edge of the unknown? How do we reconcile the comfort of community with the solitude of fear? Can we ever truly banish the shadows, or must we learn to walk beside them, mindful of their lessons? The true practice begins now, in the quiet hours after the terror has passed, in a way we attend to the subtle currents of unease that ripple beneath the surface of our days. It is in the courage to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some mysteries will never yield to our need for answers, and to find meaning not in certainty, but in the act of bearing witness. For the world is thick with secrets, and every life in its way is a journey into the mist. Even as we step back into the light, the shadows remain patient, persistent, and ever watchful, reminding us that the boundary between what is seen and what is feared is, and always will be, as thin as breath.